Good afternoon, everyone. So I am really, really excited to be here. I love presenting, so I'm hoping you all are really, really excited to still be here too. It's been a lot of presentations. So can we do one of those earlier things? Like if you're still excited to be here, can we do a little snap? Awesome. So earlier, I tweeted that Mr. Howard Booth was my new hero because I thought he was awesome. And I thought to myself, you know, I'm a nice looking guy. I work out. And I too want to be remembered. So in that same way, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But today, I want to talk to you a little bit about, there we are, the pedagogy of privilege. All right, so teaching privilege. Now, privilege is kind of a tricky subject to broach sometimes because it's something that people are usually afraid to talk about, afraid to own. It's not exactly dinner table conversation. Oh, nice. All right, so it's not exactly dinner table conversation. And essentially what you're telling people when you're kind of introducing privilege is that, so you're a part of this group, and there's some stuff that you get because you're a part of this group that other people aren't getting. And so people are kind of weird about that. They're like, oh, that's uncomfortable, that's awkward. I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm just being me, right? And it's true, no one is, well, you may be, but when you're introducing privilege, you're not sort of pointing the finger, you're not telling people that they are bad, you're just talking about this thing that exists whether we like it or not, right? And so privilege can be a tricky subject. So before we go any further, let's just define what privilege is. What we're going to talk about. All right, so here's the deal. I found out that my PowerPoint didn't exactly format the way that I wanted it to. So we're going to kind of use it, but we're going to kind of not really use it, okay? So I'm going to use my charisma to try to entertain you. All right? All right, so here we go. Let's move to the next slide. Here we go. All right, so privilege. I define privilege as access to or enjoying rights or advantages simply by membership or belonging to a certain group or identity, right? So if you need another example, think of the Sneetches. Some Sneetches had stars upon theirs, and some didn't. And the ones that had stars upon theirs were just favored, just because they were a part of that group. They did nothing to deserve it or nothing to earn it, they just got it, right? Does that make sense? Right? And this is different than the kind of privilege you get when you're like 16 and you live in your parents' house. And it's like, if you do the dishes, you can use the car. If you take your sister to the mall, you can go out on Friday night. This is different than that. This type of privilege is largely unearned and often undeserved. You might deserve it, but you might not. Just by being a part of this group, you get this type of privilege. Does that make sense? And a lot of times, the reason privilege gets tricky is I think it's the way that it's taught. Right? The way that people try to approach privilege, I think, is the part that makes it kind of threatening to people. And so for me, I got to teach last semester, which was an awesome, awesome experience. And I was attempting to teach privilege to 25 18-year-old students. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, here's me, green, first time teaching any course, and I have to try to broach the subject of privilege, which is tricky as it is, right, to 25 fresh out of high school 18-year-olds. Awesome. Awesome. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to have to come up with something special. I got to bring it. I have to bring something really special, and I have to find a way to make this non-threatening to these 18-year-olds. So I thought to myself, okay, well, what's the threatening part about it? And I think the threatening piece about privilege is that it's also often taught from what I call the single group target approach, right? So you have these labels, white privilege, male privilege, Christian privilege. What does that do? That sort of targets a single group of people who enjoy the privilege. So if I said in this room, hey, let's talk about white privilege, what does that do to all the white folks immediately? Well, it polarizes the room, right? Because everybody else who's not the white folks is going to say, hey, we're going to talk about how you need to get it together. Or if we're going to talk about male privilege, all the women are going to say, yeah, that's right. Let's tell you, we're going to tell you about yourself. So when you do this sort of single group target approach, you immediately polarize the room. It's the us and it's the them. I said, okay, I don't want to do that because I don't want to shut anybody down with my class. I want everybody to be able to understand what I'm saying to them, right? So I said, let's try to get away from that. Let's see if I can't get away from that. So I'm like, all right, I am going to create my own model of privilege. I don't need these other models that exist. I'm going to create my own model of privilege. But this is the part that gets a little icky because I don't think it came out the way I wanted it to. We'll see. I came up with what I like to call the multi-dimension model of privilege, okay? And so what the multidimensional model does is there's sort of three parts to its utility. The first is that it strips away all that single target group approach. Okay? So instead of saying male privilege, let's call it gender privilege. Instead of calling it white privilege, let's call it racial privilege. Because any race or either gender or any gender can enjoy privilege depending on the circumstance and the environment. For instance, as a man, if it's hot outside in the summertime, I can take my shirt right off. Whoop, boom. Shirts off. I'm shirtless. Great. Our Howard Booth. There we go. A woman in the summertime does not enjoy that same privilege. I get that just because I'm a guy. It doesn't necessarily give me any monetary gain or anything as a privilege, but it is something that I can do just because I'm a male, right? Whereas women, for instance, women can be very affectionate with each other, right? You see women walking down the hallway and their arms around each other. They're just affection. They can kiss on the cheek. They can do all these sort of affectionate things without their sexual orientation or gender identity being called into question. You see two men with arms around each other like, oh, they got to be gay, right? So that's a privilege that women enjoy. Right? It's a small thing, but it's something that women can do just because they're a part of that group. Okay, so I wanted to take away this sort of single target group approach, and I wanted to broaden it. So instead of talking about male privilege, we're going to talk about gender privilege, and racial privilege, and religious privilege, and ability privilege, and citizenship privilege, and appearance privilege. Okay, because these are all privileges that we enjoy all the time. Right? The second piece of this utility is that much like our identities, they don't exist in discrete pockets, right? I'm not a guy over here, and black over here, and gay over here. I'm always a black, gay male, all the time. I'm all those things from Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan. I'm always all of those things, and I'm always interacting with all of that at all times, right? You don't get to just pick which parts of your identity you are. You may focus on one more than the other, but everyone sees you for all of those things all the time. Right? So you don't get to really pick and choose. So that's why I wanted to pick a model that kind of illustrated that. So you can sort of see this. So as you can see, it's a continuum. So the multi-dimension is supposed to be colored and pretty and awesome, but it kind of got a little bit messed up in the formatting. But it's a continuum. So instead of thinking of privilege in discrete pockets of male or white or Christian or citizenship or aesthetic privilege or gender privilege, I want to think of it as a continuum with all these dimensions of privilege with which we are always interacting at all times. Does that make sense? Just like our identities, we're always interacting with these dimensions of privilege consciously or unconsciously, okay? So there may be times when I'm exerting male privilege and I don't understand that I'm doing it until you make me aware. And then I recognize it, okay? So that's sort of the utility of this model is that, one, we strip away the single group target approach, and two, we sort of look at it more holistically to say that I'm interacting with these all the time. And how am I doing that? How am I interacting with these all the time? What does that look like for me? And I chose these 8, gender, socioeconomic, orientation, religious. I chose these because these are sort of the large ones. We could probably spend all day, you all could raise your hands and give me different types of privilege, but these are sort of the large overarching ones that I thought would be pretty applicable, that anyone could sort of get a hold of and say, okay, these sort of apply to me, okay? So the third piece is that it helped, so stripping away the single group target approach, and sort of looking at it holistically, what that does is it allows you, well, the third piece of that is it allows you to not look at what other people are doing. When we talk about male privilege, well, then women get to say, well, let's look at what you're doing. We're talking about white privilege, and everybody else gets to say, well, let's look at what white folks are doing. This model looks at what you are doing. Where is your privilege? How are you interacting with your dimensions of privilege? So you're looking internally instead of externally. Does that make sense? Because if I'm pointing the finger at you, and you're pointing it at me, and you're pointing it at him, and he's pointing it at her, well, what's getting done? Really nothing. Because all I'm doing is telling you what you need to be doing. But if, in theory, if we were all looking internally and recognizing our own privilege and working with that, well, wouldn't we live in a better place, right? So that's what this model is about. It's about looking internally to say, okay, what are my dimensions of privilege? And how am I interacting with them? And how do I affect that on a daily basis, and maybe in small ways? And so there's a couple exercises that I use to illustrate this. The first is what I call a stand-up activity. You may have heard of or done a privilege walk before. Maybe anybody? Snap. Bam, there we go. All right, so you may have done a privilege walk before. A stand-up activity takes all of those dimensions of privilege that I mentioned, all 8 of them, and there are statements where you just stand up or sit down. So there is no stratification where you kind of walk up and you see at the end who's farther ahead or who's further back, because that's not what we're focusing on. What we do is I read a statement, and everyone stands up and they sit back down. And there's 50 statements to make sure that each dimension, all 8 of them, gets some coverage. And so, but what I want you to focus on when we do this, we're not going to do it, obviously, I have 5 minutes, but what the point is to focus on is every time people stand up, I encourage them to look around. See who's standing. See who's not standing. Okay? See if there's someone that you expected to be standing that isn't. See if there's someone who was standing last question that isn't. See if there's someone who's not standing that you expected would be standing. And then see if you're standing and you didn't expect to be standing. Because every time we do this, people go, you know, I never thought about that. Or I never thought I would stand up for that. Or you know, it took me a minute, I thought about it, and then I stood up. So that stand-up activity is a very helpful way to get people to think about their own privilege, because this isn't stuff we think about every day. We're thinking about getting gas, we're thinking about going to work, we're thinking about going to Meijer and picking up groceries, what we're gonna make for dinner. We're not thinking about what are the dimensions of privilege that I have and how do I exist in them. We don't think about that all the time. So this is a great way to sort of get that ticking in your mind, okay? And then the follow-up to that is what I call the privilege pledge. So I have you, after we do the step-in activity or stand-up activity, and I have everybody talk about it, we have a big discussion about it, and everyone can talk about their feelings and all that good stuff. What I have them do is a privilege pledge. So you pick one of those dimensions of privilege, one of them, that now you are more aware of after having done this exercise. And then you say, I'm going to be more aware for 30 days. 30 days. I'm going to be more aware for 30 days of this dimension of privilege and how I'm interacting with it. So maybe if you want to look at gender privilege because you're a guy, and you want to say, you know what, I'm going to stop using pejorative language toward women. That's a great way to look at your gender privilege, because it's a very small thing that you can stop doing to kind of equalize the playing field a little bit more and not exert your privilege, your gender privilege. Right? So I have them take the privilege pledge and think about really thoughtful ways that you can start to interact with privilege differently. Because everyone's interacting with it, whether you like it or not, consciously or unconsciously. You can't kind of deny it away. It's there. So it's your job to say, okay, now that I recognize it, what do I do with it? What do I do with that? And that's really the takeaway with privilege, is that, okay, now we recognize that we have it, what do we do with it? And I like to say, I would posit, as Dr. Neff says, that once you recognize that you have privilege, it is then your responsibility to work to equalize the playing field. I have something that you don't. It is now my responsibility to equalize it so that we all have it. Example, women couldn't vote at one point. It took men to say at some point, hold up, I don't think that's cool. I think women should be able to vote. It took someone within the group that had the power and the privilege to say, I don't think this is cool. I don't think this is right. We need to equalize the playing field. So if no one with privilege ever does that, nothing gets done. So it is then our responsibility to recognize that because we have privilege, it is our responsibility then to work to extend that privilege to those who don't have it, because we didn't do anything to deserve it. We just woke up one day and whoop, well, there it is, and we got it. So now it is in our job to extend that to those who don't have it. So as I give my students the privilege pledge, I will then challenge you to think about the dimensions of privilege that you're interacting with and how you're interacting with them. Are you enjoying your gender privilege or your ability privilege? Are you using the handicap stall even though you could use the other ones? Because if you're using the handicap stall, someone who can only use that stall now has to wait. Or maybe they can't go to the bathroom, or they only have 5 minutes, and now you're in that stall, you're taking it from them. That's a great example of ability privilege. So we don't think about, like, oh, I'll just use this one, it's fine. But that person who can only use that one, now they're kind of out of luck. Does that make sense? So think about the dimensions of privilege with which you're interacting, how you're interacting with them. And are you helping, or are you hurting? Are you contributing positively to solving the issue of inequality, or are you reinforcing and perpetuating inequality and people exerting their privilege negatively? I will leave you with that, and hopefully you will take that with you and be able to help make equality for everyone.